"Kill me, or stand beside me," she said, and the desert went still like it was waiting for his answer. "Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe justice doesn't always come from a gun, stay with me, because this story doesn't end the way you think." The rope hung loose in the dry Arizona air, swaying just enough to catch the late afternoon sun, casting a thin shadow across the dust. Ethan Cole sat tall in the saddle, his horse shifting under him, uneasy, like it could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on that open stretch of land. He had ridden 20 miles without water, chasing nothing but a line of smoke on the horizon, expecting trouble he could outride. But this wasn't the kind of trouble you leave behind. The woman stood at the center of a quiet circle, her dark hair pulled back, her posture straight despite the rope near her shoulders, not begging, not fighting, just waiting. Around her, Apache warriors formed a wide ring, silent as carved stone, their eyes fixed not on her, but on him. No rifles raised, no sudden moves, just patience, the kind that carried more weight than any threat. Ethan slid one boot down, hitting the ground with a soft crunch of sand and gravel, the heat rising through the leather. His hand hovered near his Colt, not touching, not yet. He had seen standoffs before. This one felt different. No anger in the air, just expectation. The woman turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his, steady and unflinching, like she had already chosen her ending and was only waiting for him to catch up. "You don't belong here," one of the elders said, voice low, measured, like wind moving through dry brush. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes stayed on her. There was something in the way she held herself. Not fear, not even resignation. Something heavier, like she was carrying more than her own life in that moment. "Then let me leave," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. A few of the warriors shifted, not stepping forward, just enough to remind him the circle was closed. The elder shook his head once. Not without choosing. Ethan's jaw tightened. Choosing what? The woman answered before the elder could speak, her voice calm, almost gentle, but it cut through the heat like a blade. "My ending." The wind picked up, dragging a thin veil of dust between them. Ethan squinted slightly, and that's when he saw it. Hanging against her chest. A small turquoise pendant, worn smooth with time, tied with a simple leather cord. His breath caught, just for a second. He knew that stone. Not just the color. The shape. The way it curved slightly on one edge. His mother had worn one just like it, every day until the day she died, always telling him it came from a place where kindness was remembered longer than anger. He had never believed her. Not out here. Not where survival came first. But now, standing in that circle, with 20 silent witnesses and a woman who refused to lower her eyes, that memory pressed against his chest harder than the heat. "Kill me," she said again, softer this time, like she was offering him mercy instead of asking for it. "Or be my husband." Ethan's hand finally dropped away from his gun. Not because the choice was easy, but because for the first time in a long while, he understood that walking away might cost more than staying. The silence did not break. It deepened, like the land itself was leaning in to hear what kind of man Ethan Cole would become in the next few seconds, and the heat pressed down harder, baking the dust into something that clung to his boots as if it wanted to keep him rooted right there. He glanced once around the circle, counting without meaning to, 20 men, maybe more beyond the ridge, none of them restless, none of them uncertain, just watching, waiting, as though the decision had already been made and he was the only one who had not yet caught up to it, and that unsettled him more than any drawn weapon ever could. The elder took a slow step forward, not threatening, not welcoming, just closing the distance enough to be heard without raising his voice, and when he spoke again, it carried the weight of something older than the language itself, something practiced across generations. "She was wife to a man who stood for our people," he said, eyes steady on Ethan. "And when he was gone, the world did not change. Only her place in it did." Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in the quiet resistance of a man who did not accept rules simply because they existed. "So you end her story here," he said, his tone flat, almost disbelieving. The elder's gaze did not waver. "We do not end anything. We keep balance." The words hung there, dry as the air between them. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting back to the woman, Ayanna, Her name still unspoken, but somehow already present in his mind like a memory he had not earned. She had not moved. Not a step. Not a shift of weight. Only her eyes followed him, calm, clear, and far too certain for someone standing at the edge of her own life. "And if I refuse?" he asked quietly. A faint ripple moved through the circle. Not alarm, not anger, just recognition that the question mattered. The elder answered without hesitation. "Then you ride away, and the sun sets the same." Ethan's jaw tightened at that, because he understood what was not being said. The world might remain the same for them, but not for her. Never for her. He dragged a hand across his face, feeling the grit of sweat and dust under his palm, grounding himself in something physical, something simple. He had lived by simple rules for a long time. You do not take what is not yours. You do not stay where you are not wanted. You do not carry burdens that are not yours to bear. Those rules had kept him alive, kept him alone. The pendant at her throat caught the light again, a brief flash of blue against the muted tones of the desert, and it pulled his thoughts back, sharper this time. His mother's voice echoed faintly, not in words, but in feeling, in the quiet certainty she used to carry even when the world around her made no sense. He swallowed hard. "You said I have to choose," he said, his voice lower now, steadier in a different way. The elder inclined his head once. "Yes." Ethan nodded slowly, more to himself than to anyone else, then looked at Ayano again, really looked this time, not as a stranger caught in a moment, but as someone standing at the center of something he could not yet see the edges of. "Why? Me?" he asked, the question leaving him before he could stop it. For the first time, something shifted in her expression, not weakness, not doubt, just a flicker of something deeper, something that had been there all along. "Because you saw," she said simply. Ethan blinked once. "Saw what?" Her gaze did not break from his. "That this is wrong." The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of sage and distant smoke, and in that moment, Ethan realized the choice had never been about them, or even about her. It was about whether he could live with himself once he turned his back, and the answer to that question was already beginning to settle in his chest, heavy and unavoidable. The words stayed between them, quiet but heavy, and for a long moment Ethan Cole did not move, because something in his chest had already begun to shift, slow and certain, like a door opening that he had kept shut for years. He looked away from Ayana for the first time since she spoke, not out of doubt, but because he needed distance from the truth she had placed in front of him so plainly. And his eyes drifted to the horizon where the desert stretched wide and empty, the kind of emptiness a man could disappear into if he chose to, the kind that asked nothing and gave nothing in return. He had lived in that silence for a long time. It had never asked him to choose anything that mattered. A dry gust rolled across the ground, lifting fine grains of dust that whispered against his coat, brushing past him like a reminder that time was moving whether he decided or not. Behind him, his horse shifted again, stamping once, uneasy with the stillness that held too long. Ethan let out a slow breath and turned back, his gaze settling on the elder. "You call this balance," he said, his voice calm but edged now. "But it feels like you are asking me to carry something that belongs to your people." The elder studied him, not offended, not defensive, only measuring. "Everything belongs to someone," he replied quietly. "Today, it belongs to you." Ethan almost smiled at that, but there was no humor in it, only the recognition that the old man was not wrong, and that made it worse. He shifted, his weight slightly, boots grinding into the dirt, grounding himself again, then looked back at Ayana. She had not spoken further. She had not pleaded. She had not tried to sway him beyond that single truth. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Most people begged when their life hung in the balance. She stood like someone who had already made peace with whichever path he chose. "If I take you as my wife," he said slowly, the words unfamiliar in his mouth, "what happens then?" A faint murmur moved through the circle, not surprise, but the acknowledgement that he had stepped closer to the line. The elder answered, his tone unchanged. "Then you take her from here. She becomes your responsibility, your world, your burden." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "And to you?" The elder's gaze flickered briefly to Ayana, then back. "To us. She is no longer bound by what came before." The simplicity of that answer struck him harder than anything else that had been said. Just like that, a life was shifted from one world to another, No ceremony. No celebration. Only a line crossed that could not be stepped back over. Ethan felt the weight of it settle in his chest, heavy and real. He turned to Ayana again, studying her face more carefully now, searching for something he might have missed. "And you?" he asked. "What do you want?" For the first time, she took a small step forward, just enough to close the space between them by a few inches, and though the warriors did not move, the air tightened as if the distance mattered. Her voice, when it came, was softer than before, but no less steady. "I want the choice to mean something," she said. Ethan frowned slightly. "It already does." She shook her head once. "Not if it is only about surviving." The words lingered, sinking in slowly. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not pressure, something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the men around him and everything to do with the way she saw the world. He had spent years avoiding choices that tied him down, that forced him to belong somewhere. Now he stood in the middle of a place that was not his, being asked to make the one choice that would bind him. Completely. His hand drifted again toward his Colt, not to draw it, but out of habit, out of the instinct to reach for something familiar when everything else shifted. He stopped short, fingers hovering, then let his hand fall away once more. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the ground, and in that quiet moment, Ethan realized something he had not expected. This was not about whether he could leave. It was about whether he could live with the man who chose to. The sun slid lower, turning the desert gold, and the shadows stretched long enough to blur the line between where one man stood and where another world began, and Ethan Cole felt it then, not as pressure from the circle around him, but as something quieter, something settling inside him with the weight of a decision already taking shape. He did not reach for his gun again, not because he had forgotten it was there, but because for the first time it felt useless, like a tool meant for problems. That could be solved with force, not with consequence. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, boots pressing into the dust until he stood no more than a few feet from Ayana, close enough to see the fine lines of sun and wind across her skin, close enough to notice that her breathing had not changed since the moment he arrived, steady, controlled, as if she had already walked this path in her mind long before he ever rode into it. The warriors did not move, but something in the air shifted, a tightening that came not from threat, but from a tension sharpened to a single point. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her in silence. Then his eyes dropped once more to the turquoise pendant resting against her chest, the stone catching the last light of day, glowing faintly like it carried something alive inside it. "That necklace," he said quietly, his voice rougher now. "Where did you get it?" Ayana's gaze followed his, and for the first time since they spoke, her expression softened just a fraction, not with weakness, but with memory. "It belonged to my grandmother," she said. Ethan swallowed, the words landing harder than he expected. "She was a healer?" Ayana nodded once. "She helped those who came. Without hatred." The desert seemed to grow quieter at that, as if even the wind paused to listen. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting for a moment, not away from her, but inward, pulled by a memory he had not touched in years, a small cabin, the smell of herbs and smoke, his mother lying weak but alive because someone she never forgot had chosen to help her when no one else would. He looked back at Ayana, something different now in his gaze, something less guarded. "My mother wore one like that," he said, the words coming slower, like he was choosing each one carefully. "She said it came from a woman who saved her life when she had nothing to offer in return." Ayana's eyes held his, steady, searching, and for a brief moment, the circle around them seemed to fade, leaving only the space between them and the weight of what connected them. "Then you already understand," she said softly. Ethan shook his head once, not in denial, but in conflict. "No," he answered, his voice low. "I understand what she believed." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly as he glanced once more at the elder, then back to her. "That does not mean I know what to do with it." The elder stepped forward again, just enough to remind Ethan that this moment did not belong only to them. "Understanding is not the same as choosing," he said calmly. Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You are right about that," he muttered. He ran a hand through his hair, pushing back the sweat and dust, then looked at Ayana again, really looking this time, not as someone caught in a moment, but as someone tied to a past he had never expected to meet. If I take you with me, he said slowly, you leave all of this behind. Ayana did not hesitate. I already have. The certainty in her voice struck him harder than anything else that had been said. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically, but in the quiet understanding that she was not asking for rescue. She was asking for meaning. And that was something far heavier than saving a life. The last light of the sun slipped lower, casting the desert in a dim glow, and Ethan realized there was no more time to stand between choices. Only time to step into one. The last light clung to the horizon like it was reluctant to leave, stretching across the desert in long, fading lines, and Ethan Cole stood there with the weight of two worlds pressing against his chest, neither one willing to step aside, neither one asking twice. He looked at Ayana, really looked, and saw not a stranger, not a burden, but someone who had already crossed a line he was still standing in front of, waiting, deciding. And that unsettled him more than anything the circle of warriors could have done. His boots shifted in the dust, a small movement, but it felt louder than it should, like the ground itself was marking the moment, and his hand moved again, not to his gun this time, but to the space at his side where nothing waited for him. No certainty, no simple answer. If I do this, he said slowly, his voice steady but low, there is no turning back. The elder gave a slight nod. Not pushing, not urging, just confirming what Ethan already knew. There never is, he replied. Ethan let that settle, the words sinking in deeper than he expected, because he had spent most of his life believing there was always a way out, always another road, another horizon, another excuse to keep moving. This was different. This was a line drawn in the dust that did not disappear with the wind. He glanced once toward his horse, the animal standing a few yards behind him, reins loose, ready to carry him away from all of this in a matter of seconds, back to the life he understood, back to the silence that never asked anything of him. For a brief moment, the path was clear. Right. Do not look back. Let the world settle itself the way it always had. But then he looked at Ayano again, and that path no longer felt empty. It felt heavy. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving him like something he had been holding onto without realizing it. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, not certainty, not confidence, but resolve. You said this choice has to mean something, he said, his eyes fixed on hers. Ayana held his gaze, unflinching. Yes. Ethan nodded. Once, almost to himself, then took a step closer, closing the space between them until there was nothing left to stand between his decision and its consequence. The warriors did not move, but their stillness sharpened, like the desert holding its breath. Ethan reached up, slowly, carefully, his hand stopping just short of the rope near her shoulders. Not touching, not yet, as if even that small motion carried weight. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he doubted, but because he understood. This was the moment. Not the words, not the explanation, just this. His hand lowered, not to the rope, but to his side again, and he looked at her, really seeing her now, not as someone to be saved, not as someone to be chosen, but as someone standing equal in a moment neither of them had asked for. If I stand with you, he said quietly, it is not because I was forced. Ayana's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, just enough to be felt more than seen. Then stand, she replied. The wind moved through the circle, lifting the edges of coats and brushing against the ground, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust, and Ethan felt the last piece fall into place, not as a question, but as an answer he could not ignore anymore. He turned his head slightly toward the elder, meeting his gaze without hesitation. There is one thing you have not said, Ethan added. The elder raised an eyebrow faintly. What is that? Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to show the weight behind his words. What happens if I choose her, but I do not belong to either world after? The question lingered, hanging in the air like the last light of the day, and for the first time, the elder did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at Ethan with something new in his expression, not authority, not expectation, but something closer to respect. Then you will have to build one of your own, he said quietly. Ethan held that gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at Ayana, and in the fading light, with the desert stretching wide and silent around them, he understood that whatever came next would not be given. It would be made. The wind moved slower now, as if Even it understood something had shifted, and Ethan Cole stood there with the weight of his own words still echoing inside him. Not loud, not forceful, just steady, like something that would not leave once it settled. He did not look away this time. Not from Ayanna, not from the circle around them, because there was no space left for hesitation. Only the quiet space where a man either stepped forward or stepped back, and Ethan had already gone too far to pretend he could return unchanged. He took another step, small but final, closing the last inches between them until the distance no longer belonged to doubt, but to consequence. And though no one spoke, the air carried a different kind of tension now, not waiting, but witnessing. Ayanna's eyes held his, steady as before, but there was something new beneath the surface, something that had not been there when he first arrived. Not hope, not relief, something deeper, something that felt like recognition. Ethan exhaled slowly, then lifted his hand again, this time without stopping, his fingers moving with deliberate care until they hovered just beside the turquoise pendant at her chest, close enough to feel the faint warmth of it without touching, like he was acknowledging something sacred without claiming it. "My mother said something once," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she and the elder could hear. "She said the people who gave this kind of stone did not do it lightly." Ayanna's gaze softened again, just a fraction. "They did not," she replied. Ethan nodded, more to himself than to her, then let his hand fall, not uncertain now, but resolved in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely right. Behind them, one of the warriors shifted his stance, the faint crunch of gravel breaking the silence for just a second before it settled again. But no one stepped forward, no one interrupted, as if they all understood this moment did not belong to them. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the elder, meeting his gaze with a calm that had not been there before. "You said if I choose, she becomes my responsibility," he said. The elder inclined his head once. "Yes." Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to show he understood what that meant, not just for tonight, not just for this place, but for every mile that came after. "Then I do not take that lightly," he added. The elder studied him for a long moment, eyes searching not for strength, but for truth, and whatever he found there seemed to settle something, because he gave a small nod, not approval, not permission, but acknowledgement. Ethan turned back to Ayanna, and this time when he looked at her, it was different, not as someone caught in a moment, not as someone asking him to decide her fate, but as someone who would walk beside whatever came next, whether either of them fully understood it or not. "If I stand with you," he said quietly, "it will not be because I had no other choice." Ayanna held his gaze, her voice steady as the desert itself. "Then it will be enough." The words settled between them, simple, but carrying more weight than anything else that had been said. Ethan gave a faint nod, then did something none of the warriors had expected, not dramatic, not loud, but clear. He stepped to her side, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, where neither shielded the other and neither stood alone. The circle remained still, but the meaning of it changed in that instant, no longer a boundary holding something in place, but a witness to something being formed. The last light of the sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky dim and wide above them. And in that quiet shift from day to night, Ethan Cole understood that he had not just chosen a woman, he had chosen a path that would ask more from him than anything he had ever faced, and for the first time, he did not look for a way around it. No one spoke when he stepped beside her, but the silence changed. It was no longer waiting for a decision, it was measuring what that decision meant, and Ethan Cole could feel it in the way the air settled around him. Heavier but somehow clearer, like the desert itself had accepted something without needing to say it aloud. The warriors did not close in, they did not step back, they simply watched. And that was enough to remind him that standing here was only the beginning of what he had just taken on. Ayanna did not move away from him, did not lean toward him either. She simply stood, steady as before, but now the space between them was shared, not divided, and Ethan realized that this was what she had meant, not survival, not escape, but something that held weight beyond the moment. The elder stepped forward once more, slower this time, as if the ground itself deserved respect for what had just been chosen, and when he stopped a few feet from them, his eyes moved from Ethan to Ayanna and back again, taking in the quiet truth of their position. "Then it is done," he said, his voice carrying across the circle without force. No one questioned it. No one challenged it. The words settled like dust, simple, final. Ethan shifted slightly, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders now that the moment had passed, but there was no relief in it, only the awareness that what came next would not be decided here. He glanced once toward the edge of the circle, toward the open land beyond, the path that would take him away from this place, and for the first time, he did not see it as escape. He saw it as responsibility. Ayanna turned her head slightly, following his gaze, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, not comfort, not reassurance, just the understanding that neither of them was stepping into something simple. "You should take water before you leave," the elder said, his tone practical now, as if the ceremony of choice had ended and the reality of the desert had returned. Ethan gave a small nod. "I will." One of the younger warriors stepped forward, carrying a worn canteen, offering it without hesitation. Ethan accepted it, his fingers brushing briefly against the leather, noticing the care in its stitching, the kind of detail that came from people who did not waste anything, not even time. He took a slow drink, the water warm but steadying, then handed it back with a quiet nod of thanks. The warrior did not speak, but his eyes held something different now, not suspicion, not approval, something closer to recognition. Ethan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and turned slightly toward Ayanna. "Do you have anything you need to take?" he asked. She shook her head once. "Everything I need is already with me." Ethan glanced briefly at the pendant again, understanding what she meant, then nodded. Behind them, the circle began to shift, not breaking apart abruptly, but loosening, like a boundary that was no longer needed, and the warriors stepped back one by one, creating space where there had been none. No one rushed them. No one followed. The desert opened slowly, like a door that had always been there, but had never been meant for him until now. Ethan walked toward his horse, each step deliberate, aware of Ayanna beside him, not trailing behind, not being led, but walking in equal measure, her pace matching his without effort. When he reached the horse, he paused, resting a hand briefly on the saddle, feeling the familiar worn leather under his palm, grounding himself in something he understood before stepping into what he did not. He looked out across the darkening land, the sky now deepening into shades of blue and shadow, and for a moment, he wondered what waited beyond the next mile, beyond the next town, beyond the next question he would have to answer. Then he turned to Ayanna, meeting her gaze once more, and though neither of them spoke, there was no need to. The choice had already been made. What remained was whether the world they were riding into would understand it. The first step away from the circle felt heavier than any mile Ethan Cole had ever ridden, not because the ground resisted him, but because something inside him understood there was no clear path ahead, only one that would have to be made with every step they took. The desert stretched wide under a sky turning darker by the minute, the last trace of sunlight fading behind distant ridges, and the air carried that quiet shift that came when day finally gave up its hold. Ethan reached for the saddle and tightened the strap with practiced hands, the familiar motion grounding him for a moment, giving him something steady to hold on to while everything else shifted around him. Then he paused, his hand resting against the worn leather, and glanced at Ayanna. She stood a few feet away, watching the horizon, not the tribe. Behind them, not the man beside her, but the open land ahead, as if she had already accepted that whatever came next would not come from looking back. "You have ridden before?" he asked, his voice calm, almost casual, though nothing about this moment felt ordinary. She nodded once. "Enough to follow my own path." Ethan gave a faint nod, then adjusted the stirrup slightly, creating space without making it seem like he was offering help she did not ask for. He stepped back and gestured lightly. "Then we ride." Ayanna moved without hesitation, placing her foot in the stirrup and pulling herself up with quiet efficiency, settling into the saddle with the kind of balance that came from experience, not instruction, and Ethan noticed it, the way she carried herself, the way she did not need guidance, and something in him eased just slightly at that. He took the reins and mounted behind her, not too close, leaving space between them, respecting something unspoken, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The horse shifted under their weight, sensing the pause, ears flicking toward the open land ahead. Ethan glanced once over his shoulder, back toward the tribe, and saw that they had not followed. They stood where they had been, silhouettes against the fading light, watching without calling out, without signaling, just witnessing the choice that had already been made. He turned back forward and exhaled slowly, then gave a light nudge with his heel. The horse stepped forward, slow at first, then steady, carrying them away from the only certainty either of them had known that day. The sound of hooves against dry earth filled the silence between them, rhythmic, grounding, and for a long stretch, neither spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words felt too small for what had just happened. The desert opened wider with each yard, the darkness settling in deeper, and the stars began to appear one by one, faint at first, then stronger, like quiet witnesses above them. After a while, Ethan shifted slightly in the saddle, adjusting his grip on the reins. "There is a town about 15 miles east," he said, breaking the silence without forcing it. "Small place. Not much to offer, but enough for the night." Ayanna did not turn, but her voice came steady. "And after that?" Ethan's eyes stayed on the horizon. "After that, we keep moving until we find a place that does not ask questions we cannot answer." A faint pause followed. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "There will be questions." Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like agreement. "There always are." The horse continued forward, steady and sure, and the distance between them and the tribe behind them grew with every step, not just in miles, but in meaning, and Ethan felt it, not as relief, but as a shift, like the ground beneath his life had moved and would not settle back the same way again. He glanced briefly at the pendant resting against Ayanna's chest, catching a faint glimmer of starlight now, and something in him tightened, not with doubt, but with the quiet understanding that whatever this path became, it had started long before this moment, long before either of them knew it. The wind picked up slightly, cooler now, carrying the scent of night across the land, and as they rode deeper into the dark, Ethan Cole realized that leaving had been the easier part. It was what waited ahead, in a world that might not understand what he had chosen, that would test whether this decision was strength or something far more difficult. By the time the first lights of the town came into view, faint and flickering like they were unsure they belonged in that vast darkness, Ethan Cole had not said another word, and neither had Ayanna. Because some silences did not need to be filled, they needed to be carried, mile after mile, until they revealed what they meant. The road dipped slightly as they approached, the dry earth giving way to a more traveled path marked by wagon tracks and hoof prints, signs of a world that followed. Different rules Ethan knew too well. He slowed the horse just before the edge of town, the wooden buildings sitting low under the night sky, lanterns swaying gently outside doorways, casting uneven light across the ground, and for a moment, he did not move forward. Ayanna felt it, the hesitation, not in his hands, but in the way. The horse shifted, sensing the pause. "This is where your world begins again," she said quietly. Ethan let out a slow breath, eyes scanning the street ahead, the silhouettes of a few figures moving in the distance, unaware of what was about to step into their line of sight. "It never stopped," he replied. "It just did not have me in it for a while." He nudged the horse forward, slow and steady, guiding them into the narrow street, the sound of hooves echoing softer now against packed dirt and scattered wood. A man near a doorway glanced up first, then another, their attention catching not on Ethan alone, but on the shape of two people riding as one, on the quiet presence that did not match what they expected. No one spoke. Not yet. But the questions were already there, hanging in the air thicker than the dust. Ethan felt them without needing to hear them, felt the weight of every look, every assumption forming before a single word was said. He did not turn away from it. He did not try to explain. He simply rode forward, his posture steady, his gaze fixed ahead like a man who had already decided he would not step back from what he carried. They reached the small stable at the edge of the street, and Ethan swung down first, boots hitting the ground with a familiar thud. Then he turned, offering his hand without hesitation, not as an act of control, but as a simple acknowledgement of the step she was about to take into a world that might not understand her. Ayanna looked at his hand for a brief moment, then took it, her grip firm, her movement controlled as she stepped down beside him, her feet touching ground that did not feel like hers, but she did not falter. A few steps away, the stable keeper watched them, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving from Ethan to Ayanna and back again, measuring, questioning, but saying nothing. Ethan met his gaze for a moment, then looked away, not out of avoidance, but because he understood something had changed. He was no longer just passing through. He was part of what they saw. He reached for the reins, tying the horse loosely, then stood there for a second, the sounds of the town settling around them, distant voices, the creak of wood, the low murmur of life continuing as it always had. Ayanna stood beside him, her presence quiet but undeniable, and Ethan realized something he had not fully faced until now. This was the test. Not the circle in the desert. Not the choice itself. But this. Standing in a place where no one understood what had been chosen and deciding whether to hold it anyway. He glanced at her once more, then toward the dim lights spilling from a small building across the street. "We will find a place to rest," he said. Ayanna nodded, her eyes steady. "And tomorrow?" Ethan looked out at the town, at the narrow road that stretched beyond it into places neither of them could yet see, then back at her. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we begin to see if the world can learn something it has forgotten." The wind moved lightly through the street, carrying dust and the faint scent of wood smoke. And in that quiet moment, with no one speaking and no one stepping forward, Ethan Cole stood beside Ayanna, not as a man who had solved anything, but as one who had chosen to carry something forward, knowing full well the world might not be ready for it, and understanding that sometimes that was exactly why it had to be done.